Okay. What I want to do today is the stragglers of you who have made it into November in this class. You are to be congratulated. On Wednesday, it's going to be much colder, so I expect attendance will be even more reduced. But what I want to do today is talk about the impact of the First World War in the Middle East, or at least what we call the Middle East. And what we call the Middle East is in many ways a product of the First World War. The idea, the names, the definitions, the boundaries we give to this region are all a reflection of stuff that happens between 1914 and basically 1925 or 1926. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. And this is enormously relevant for today's world. If you want to understand a lot of the past 10 to 12 years in this region, why relationships are as they are, why people from outside of this region are viewed as they are, why the boundaries that are in this region exist today when perhaps they should not, you need to understand what happens during the First World War. It's fundamental for understanding this region. No one ever listens to historians when they want to think about intervening in this region, which is a terrible mistake, because you should listen to us. We're very boring, we always qualify everything, but in the end we're right. So I would urge you in future, don't listen to the political scientists. They just predict things. We actually know what happened. What I want to talk about today is the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. That is, when you get the start of the war, you have not only the Germans and the Austrians fighting on one side, you get, in the fall of 1914, the Ottomans jumping in as well. As I mentioned before, the Ottomans come in because this is a last-ditch effort to try to save their empire. They've gradually lost control of most of North Africa. They're trying to hold on to this area here, between roughly Egypt, which is a British possession, and Syria. They are hoping that an alliance with the Germans will ultimately give them the wherewithal, the capability to kick the British and the French out of North Africa and to reassert their own control in this region. It is a pipe dream. The Ottomans do not have the capability to do it. The Germans will not be able to fight the Russians and supply the Ottomans to the extent needed. And the Ottomans are underestimating the fact that when the British and the French hear that the Ottomans are going to war with them, they are, if not gleeful, they are extremely enthusiastic, because they think, now we can take the rest of this territory away from them. That is, the Ottomans don't realize that the Ottomans think this is their opportunity to reassert their empire. The British and the French, especially the British, think this is their effort to finish off, or this is their attempt, their moment, their opportunity, where they can finish the Ottomans off completely. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire, which extends from the Arabia Peninsula all the way up through Syria, what's now modern-day Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, this empire is a patchwork of provinces, almost sort of states, you might say, which are governed overall by the Turkish Ottomans, but in which provincial elites, regional groups, have a lot of power, a lot of autonomy. And the most sort of ambitious of these groups is a family whose dynastic name is, they are called the Hashemites. H-A-S-H-E-M-I-T-E-S. The Hashemites. The Hashemites are, or have, a particular position within not just the Ottoman Empire, not just within Arabia, but within the world of Islam as well. The Hashemite family has for generations held the position called the Sharif, S-H-A-R-I-F, the Sharif of Mecca. That is, they basically are responsible for maintaining the safety of and the security of the city of Mecca, the city to which all Muslims must try in their lives to make one pilgrimage. So the Hashemites have this particular designation. They are the Hashemite family occupies the position of Sharif of Mecca. And the Hashemites have ambitions. This is the crown prince of the Hashemite family. His name is Faisal, Faisal, Prince Faisal. He's an Arab, a Sunni Arab. He is someone who believes that the breakup of the Ottoman Empire might allow the Hashemites to extend their power over former Ottoman territories. That is, Faisal, his brother, his father Muhammad, who is technically the Sharif of Mecca, they all have this dream that they can create basically a new Arab kingdom. Remember, the Ottomans aren't Arabs, they're Turks. But they have this dream that they can create a new Arab kingdom that will include Arabia and the other Arab-speaking lands or Arabic-speaking lands of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, etc. The British know this, and the British in 1914 and 1915 reach out to Faisal and the Hashemites. They do so through this man here. Anybody know who this is?
T.E. Lawrence.
T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia. Thank you. He is an army officer, someone who had been fascinated with this region even as an undergraduate in college, and he's someone who is used to convey messages to Faisal and the Hashemites. And in 1914 and 1915, the British government, they don't make any agreements with the Hashemites, but they propose an informal arrangement. They say, if you can help us take on the Ottomans, you can help us raid supply trains coming into this region. You can help us gather intelligence. You can stage hit-and-run raids on Ottoman outposts. If you can help us, we will throw our support behind the establishment of an Arab kingdom in this region. Now, they don't have a treaty. They don't have some binding legal agreement. The British are too careful to do that. What they do is they lead Faisal and his family to believe that after the war, the British will support an Arab kingdom in this region. An Arab kingdom that will have a couple of important points. That is that the Hashemites will control more than the Arabian Peninsula, and the Hashemites will at least have a say in what happens to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a huge flashpoint. Jerusalem, holy to the three monotheistic religions of this region, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Concern over who rules Jerusalem had been around for 1,000 years in the Mediterranean, from the Crusades onward. And so, Faisal thinks at least he's going to get a say in how Jerusalem is going to be run. This is the first of 3 different deals that the British are going to make in this region concerning the future. If you want to understand why outside actors, particularly you might say Anglo-American actors, are not trusted when they come to this region saying, trust me, it has its origins in this. The fact that Britain makes promises to Faisal that it has no intention of keeping. You can see here, this is when Faisal arrives at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 with Lawrence. None of them look very happy. It's because they just realized that the British have pulled the fast one. Because, as I'll now line out or illustrate for you, there are other deals the British make. They're not satisfied simply with saying, okay, we'll support the Hashemites' control of an Arab kingdom, and you help us in the war. The Hashemites will help in the war. But they're not the only sort of party that the British are willing to make a deal with. In 1916, Britain makes a deal with the French. two diplomats, one French, oops, two diplomats, a Brit named Sykes, S-Y-K-E-S, and a Frenchman named Picot, P-I-C-O-T, make the unsurprisingly named Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which says, okay, we're going to divide up the Ottoman region this way. What they say is, we're going to give Faisal Arabia, and that's it. Faisal thinks he's going to get this whole thing. At this point in time, the French and the British calculate, what is in Arabia? Nothing's in Arabia. They look out, they say it's empty. They don't realize quite what's underneath Arabia. But they say, Faisal will get this, he'll have to live with it. We will divide up this region. The French will take the dark and light blue parts, the British will take the dark and light red parts. They'll rule some of these directly, and other ones they will install a puppet ruler. And they will establish boundaries. That is, they're going to establish new states here. There are no states here. There are Ottoman provinces, but there's no nations there. The British and the French are going to invent what comes to be Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. The British and the French agree that a consortium of countries will control the area around Jerusalem. A consortium that does not include the Hashemites. So a bunch of European countries will control the area around Jerusalem. So if you're keeping score, the British have now made two different promises about this region. One to the Hashemites, one with the French. About which part the Hashemites will get, how this will be divided, and who's going to be important to talking about in having influence over Jerusalem. They're not done. In 1917, Britain does something else. The British government and the British Foreign Secretary, the equivalent of the Secretary of State, a man named Lord Balfour, B-A-L-F-O-U-R, Lord Balfour, he writes a letter to a group known as the Zionists, Z-I-O-N-I-S-T. The Zionists were a group of European Jews who in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, had formed an association to try to promote the resettlement of European Jews outside of Europe. They had their eyes particularly on Palestine, an Ottoman territory, the Ottoman territory that contained Jerusalem. But in the late 19th century, there had been a surge in violence in Germany, in Poland, and in Russia against Jews. And one response was the creation of this Zionist association, or Zionist organization, to try to move Jews out of harm's way and to establish a Jewish homeland, preferably in Palestine. In late 1917, the British government is concerned that the Americans have entered the war, but they're not perhaps as enthusiastic as they ought to be. That the Americans have basically been provoked into entering the war by the Germans, but they're not that enthusiastic. The British and those who lead the British government share certain, you might say, stereotypical views of how the world works. In Europe, there was this belief that Jews did not belong to any state. That is, that the loyalty of Jews was only to other Jews. That they were not good patriots, they were not good nationalists. They were only interested in basically supporting each other. It's part of a long tradition of European anti-Semitism, one which tends to see Jews as, in essence, not quite belonging. The British government, and people like Lord Balfour who are making this policy, they believed, basically, that they needed American Jews to support the war effort more enthusiastically. because they believed that American Jews controlled the United States or controlled American finances to a significant degree. They're basing all of this not on reality, they're basing it on these anti-Semitic ideas that have received a lot of attention in the late 19th and early 20th century. There are various anti-Semitic pamphlets and writings published and promoted. People like Henry Ford in this country are significant anti-Semites and significant publicists of anti-Semitic literature. But what's interesting about this is that the British believe that basically American Jews have huge influence on American foreign policy because they control the American treasury, they control American finances. So what the British do is the British reach out to the Zionists and they say, we will support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. They're not doing it because they really believe in it necessarily. They're doing it because they think it will keep American Jews interested in going to war. Again, it's the British trying to sort of play or using certain types of stereotypes that are around to try to play, please put your phones away if you are currently using one, to try and play off of this Zionist organization's drive to create this homeland. So it says here is His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This is called the Balfour Declaration, after Lord Balfour, B-A-L-F-O. So what you've got now is the British have said to the Hashemites, you'll get an Arab kingdom, and some say over Jerusalem. The British said to the French, the Hashemites will only get the Arabian Peninsula, we'll divide the rest, and a bunch of European powers will decide what happens to Jerusalem. This letter says nothing about the rest of the region, but it says we support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Jerusalem, or in the region around Jerusalem, Palestine. So in 3 years, the British have made 3 different sets of promises to 3 different groups. Completely living up to every sort of stereotype about British behavior in the early 20th century, they decide to go a 4th way. That is, having made promises to 3 different groups, they decide, let's disappoint them all equally. And what the British wind up doing is this. Faisal gets Arabia. The French get a much smaller portion than they thought they'd get in the treaty. This is what happens when the British have 1 million troops in this region at the end of the war. You tend to be able to sort of set the boundaries. The British take a large slice, what eventually becomes known as Transjordan, now Jordan, and the state of Iraq. More on this in a moment. And the British take over Palestine themselves. Faisal doesn't get a say, the international community doesn't get a say, and, at least initially, it's not a designated homeland for the Zionists. Instead, it's a British colony. So basically, the Brits have managed in the space of 4 years to raise the hopes of, and then dash the hopes of, multiple groups in and outside this region. And if you want to look at how and why a generalized mistrust of Europeans, particularly the British and then the Americans, exists in this region, you have to go back and understand that in the First World War, this is what the British did. That every time thereafter that someone like the British or the Americans comes to the Middle East and says, we're here to help, people are not going to believe them. People can tell you, oh, we will be greeted as liberators. You may have heard that when we come to this and that section of the Middle East. No. There is always going to be suspicion about underlying motives and underlying sort of plans that the rhetoric of liberation or aid or something like that might disguise. So by 1920, the British control large sections of this area. Let me say a few things about a couple of the places they control. In the first place, they control Palestine. they are going to allow for significant Jewish migration into Palestine in the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s. But they're not going to support the creation of a Zionist state. The Zionist organization will, by the middle of the 1930s, be very frustrated with the British. Simultaneously, the fact that the British will allow tens of thousands of Jews into this region in the 20s and 30s angers and alienates lots of Palestinian Arabs. Not just Muslims. There is a significant Palestinian Christian population. So you have Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims, both of whom are Arabs. This is why people tend to get lost when they talk about this region, because they don't understand that it's a complicated place. You can be an Arab Christian. Arab does not mean Muslim. Muslim means Muslim. Arab, that's an ethnicity. That's a language. So you have Arab Christians in Palestine. You have Arab Muslims in Palestine. You have Zionist settlers. By the early 1930s, you start to see Palestinian Arabs attacking these Jewish settlements. And many of these Zionist settlers respond not by appealing to the British, but by forming basically their own militia groups, their own sort of paramilitary groups to try to defend themselves. They will in turn go out and start attacking Arab villages and Arab populations in this region. By 1937 and 1938, the British are presiding over a Palestine in which neither group likes the British and neither group likes each other. Sorry?
Why did the Palestinian Arabs attack the Jewish groups?
Because they saw that they thought they were going to be pushed out. They thought that it wasn't necessarily, they weren't necessarily pushing out people at that point, but the Palestinian Arabs viewed that as what was going to come. And there will be, in the late 1940s, there will be the eviction of Palestinian Arabs in this region by Jewish settlers. But they're not enough in the 1930s to create that sort of forced eviction yet. But the Palestinian Arabs believe it's coming, and they believe they need to act against these Jewish settlements before they become sort of too many people there to resist against. At the same time, you have the Zionists who are in essence setting up their own sort of parallel government, even though the British aren't encouraging it, and are setting up their own sort of militia to protect themselves and ultimately to attack, at times unprovoked, Palestinian Arabs as well. In 1939, with the world facing war, the British decide that they don't want to be worrying about the loyalty of Palestinian Arabs during this conflict that's coming. And so what they do is they halt all Jewish migration into Palestine. This is 1939. They say no more Jews are allowed to immigrate into Palestine. They do this at a time in which the number of Jews trying to leave Central Europe is reaching its peak because of what the Nazis are up to. And the British are very cynical about this. In essence, they say, we want to make sure that the Palestinian Arabs will not aid the Germans during the war. So we don't want to alienate them anymore. And in essence, the British make the calculation that the Jewish population in Palestine, it's not going to take out its anger on the British by joining with the Germans. So in essence, they can do this. So in 1939, they shut the borders of Palestine, basically. They're not the only ones to do it. This country as well did not really cover itself in glory in the late 1930s when European Jews were trying to escape, especially after the fall of 1938. There's a famous ship called the St. Louis, which in 1939 tries to dock at various ports on the East Coast, tries to land in Cuba, is ultimately sent back to Europe. It contains German and Dutch Jews, nearly all of whom will then die in the Holocaust. But in Britain, in the United States, elsewhere in the world, there was a real reluctance to take Jewish refugees right before the war. What's funny is that, or not funny, or ironic, or perhaps may not be familiar to you, is that the places that do take a significant number of Jewish refugees in the late 1930s are not Western European states. In fact, at times, are Muslim states, Islamic states. That is, a large number of Jews wind up in Istanbul, wind up in India, and even wind up in China during the war. Ultimately, a place like Istanbul is, in particular, much more hospitable to them than Britain or France or the United States. So at a time in which you have a large number of European Jews desperately trying to get out of Europe, the British shut the door in Palestine. By the end of the 1940s, British rule in Palestine, by 1946, British rule in Palestine is completely untenable. There is huge pressure coming from the Zionists to restart migration into Palestine. Now, after the Holocaust, after the world has become aware of the extent of the Holocaust, you have Palestinian Arab resistance. You have both sides attacking each other and attacking the British. You have Zionist, what you might almost call terrorist groups, bombing British buildings and killing British administrators and soldiers in 1946. So the British basically leave. In 1948, the British do the diplomatic equivalent of leaving the key under the mat. And the last British governor in Palestine, in essence, basically writes a letter saying, you guys sort this out. We're leaving. And they do. And you get civil war in Palestine. But the 20 to 30 years that the British control Palestine are an enormously controversial period. That's an enormously controversial period. A time in which the British manage the rare feat of uniting everyone else in Palestine, at least temporarily, against them. The British and the Germans have this ability to get people to dislike them. It's really unparalleled in world history. And more on the Germans to come. But it's generally perceived to be a massive failure on the part of the British government in Palestine. That in essence they leave in 1948 having presided over the complete breakdown of this region, the growth of enormous violence in this region, and in essence allowing for a vicious civil war to begin. But again, remember, this is Britain, which had promised the future of this to three different groups, wound up going a fourth way, and then tried to, in essence, play the groups off one another or tried to appeal to the loyalties of each group at different times. So perhaps it's not necessarily a shock that you have this outcome. Let's talk about a couple of other ramifications. That is, if you want to understand how and why what we think of as the modern Middle East and all that that entails, all that that suggests, comes to be, we also need to look at the case of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula is what Faisal gets. Remember that when they finally divide everything up at Versailles formally, Faisal just gets Arabia, which the British, the French, and others think is, in essence, empty. There have been some indications that there might be a little bit of oil there, but nothing like what is perceived to be in other parts of this former Ottoman territory, like Iraq. Faisal and the Hashemites suffer because of this. They don't get their Arab kingdom, instead they get simply Arabia. And in this new state of Arabia, or this new kingdom of Arabia, they face significant internal resistance. They face resistance, most of all, from people who believe now the Hashemites are weak, and people who believe that now that the Ottomans are gone, now that British support for the Hashemites has dried up, it's time for them to take on the Hashemites. You have people who believe, as I said, that the Hashemites have been proved weak, that the Hashemites have failed to deliver on this large-scale kingdom. There's also people in Arabia who think that the Hashemites, despite the fact that they are the Sharifs of Mecca, are not really very good Muslims. That they are too westernized, too interested in luxury, too interested in political power. In 1925, you get a civil war in Arabia between the Hashemites and their dwindling number of supporters and a different group led by a man named Ibn Saud. I-B-N, new word, S-A-U-D. Ibn Saud. He is the patriarch, the leader of a family that has traditionally been fairly nomadic in this region. A family which holds to a very sort of orthodox Islamic practice. They look at the Hashemites and say they are decadent. They are not true Muslims. What the Saud family holds to is a form of Islam which not only sort of is very sort of is not only based solely in the Quran, but also seems to derive some of its beliefs from pre-Islamic culture in Arabia. That is the culture of the pre-Islamic nomadic tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. This is particularly true in the way in which the Sauds view women. That is, the Sauds and their followers, their relatives and others, who take over Arabia in 1926 and rename it, unsurprisingly, Saudi Arabia. They take this over and begin to institute or to create a state based on very, very strict religious law. As I said, a religious law which is not only based in the Quran, but also very much in what seem to be pre-Islamic traditions. The traditions associated with the nomads and other traders, mobile people in pre-Islamic Arabia, where women were regarded as not just secondary, but apart from being sort of mothers, as almost unnecessary. The rest of the world doesn't care about the fact that you have this civil war and that this family wins. The British do take care of Faisal. They make his brother the king of Jordan. They make Faisal the king of Iraq. As sort of, a consolation prize. But this is huge, because the fact is, Faisal and the Hashemites are unable to get their big Arab kingdom after the war. They are left exposed to internal opposition. And the group that wins, the Sauds, the Saudi dynasty, a group which espouses a very specific and very orthodox form of Islam, they not only take over this area, but very soon they are going to be insanely wealthy. That's the thing you have to remember. It's not only that a group with a very specific vision of how the world works takes over this region. It's that a group with a very specific vision of how the world works is very soon going to become one of the wealthiest groups the world has ever seen. With the ability to transmit and to transfer their vision of the world elsewhere. That's the thing. The vision of Islam, which is present in Saudi Arabia in the 1920s, is one which the Saudis will be very easily able to export because they will have the means. If you want to see, this is a famous image. This is King Saud, Ibn Saud. This is in 1943, after meetings at Casablanca of the Allies. Here you have King Saud being paid all sorts of attention by, I'm not sure who the American general is here, but there's Franklin Roosevelt, of course. You have an American general here, literally on one knee, in front of Ibn Saud. People always, complain, oh, such and such bowed to a leader, he bowed to this. This is an American general on one knee in front of the king of Saudi Arabia. Because American tanks don't run on ethanol. In 1940, they still don't run on ethanol, if you're familiar with it. You have the Sauds who control an enormous amount of this very valuable resource. Which means that this group that takes over in 1926 in Arabia, which many people look at as sort of backwards and provincial and not very influential, within 20 years they're being treated like this. Because of how much petroleum, because of how much oil is in the ground. And you have created in Saudi Arabia, I'm going to sort of, bring us closer to the present than perhaps you would imagine we'd go today, but you have in Saudi Arabia, over the course of the 20th and early 21st century, this strange juxtaposition of a royal family whose ideology and whose public belief system is very rigid, urges the living of a very simple life, a very doctrinaire understanding of how the world works. On the other hand, you have a family which, by the 1940s and after, lives an insanely wealthy life. The former Saudi ambassador, anyone ever see his house up in Aspen? Anyone ever been by it? It's about 5 times the size of the White House. I think it's for sale if you got a couple bucks lying around. But it's emblematic of the fact that this family becomes very worldly and very wealthy very quickly. The Saudi royal family. The ones who still run Saudi Arabia to this day. This is a problem. And not just for the Saudi royal family, but it turns out it's a problem for the rest of the world. And here's why. The Saudi royal family likes living this life. The various members of this family, a very large extended group, enjoy a lot of perks. The Saudi elites generally profit enormously from what is found in Saudi Arabia. The problem is this. They are not living, by the 60s and 70s, they are absolutely not living according to their professed ideals. At least the Saudi men are not. They are living rich, wealthy, materialistic lives. And starting in the 1970s, there's a backlash in Saudi Arabia against the royal family. People whose ideology says one thing, whose promotion of their faith says you go this way, but whose lives are very much heading in the opposite direction. And in the 1970s, there starts to be, in Saudi Arabia, real resistance to the royal family and the way they do business. You start to get Muslim clerics and teachers and scholars saying that the orthodox sort of Islam that this family used to promote is no longer there. And this is hugely worrying for the Saudis. Because after all, Ibn Saud, in 1925 and 26, had made a case for removing the Hashemites by saying they are not good enough Muslims to protect Mecca. Now his family is the one, or his family, they are the ones who protect Mecca. And there's a lot of criticism in the 1970s within Saudi Arabia. At universities there, among the younger generation, who see the failure of the Saudi royal family to live up to its own ideals. There will be an effort by some of these students to take over Mecca. in the late 1970s. They will literally storm the city and take over the square known as the Kaaba, which is the centerpiece of the entire pilgrimage site.
Mecca is in Saudi Arabia.
Mecca is in Saudi Arabia. Mecca is in Saudi Arabia. The center of Mecca, don't worry about the same. There's a square. It's known as the Kaaba. It's where pilgrims go, and you do a circle around this enormous block that's in the middle. The Saudi government is scared out of their minds because now they are directly being challenged. It's like I said, back when we were talking about Beijing and Young Lei creating Beijing. You create these places that are seen as homes of power that give you legitimacy. And if somebody comes in and challenges you there, that's a real threat. These Saudi students and activists in the late 70s were directly challenging the Saudi regime, directly challenging their ability to control Mecca. And the Saudis ultimately had to oust them, using special commandos that they had trained by the French. Which doesn't make things better for the Saudis. Sorry? It's a group of students. It's basically a group of students and younger Islamic scholars who believe that basically the Saudi regime, the Saudi royal family, is corrupt and tainted. And they are no longer to be entrusted with protecting Mecca. The Saudi royal family gets them out, executes them. There's mass executions. But the Saudi royal family is also very shaken by what happens. They have not wiped out all of this opposition within Saudi Arabia. There are others in Saudi Arabia who also are beginning to have thoughts about the decadence of this regime. One of them is the son of a Yemeni contractor. Who am I talking about? Yemeni contractor, a man from Yemen who's made a fortune in Saudi Arabia building roads and infrastructure for the Saudis. Yes, Osama bin Laden. One of the sons of a family which is wealthy by the early 1970s, but Osama bin Laden himself is getting radicalized. The Saudi royal family decides that rather than worry about the radicals, they're in essence going to buy them off, because after all, they have the money. And so what they do is this. They decide, we are going to export this form of Islam. We have all of this younger generation which wants to promote a different sort of Islam, wants to promote a different sort of vision of the world. Let's find places to send them to do that. Let's sponsor them. The Saudis are thinking this, and oh look, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. All of a sudden, you now have a place to send them. So the Saudis are quite happy to basically take their religious problem and export it to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to other parts of the world, because it gets them out of Saudi Arabia. Rather than trying to imprison everyone, send them away. Give them an enormous check. This is what the Saudis do. In the 1980s, the Saudis send an enormous amount of money into Afghanistan and to Pakistan to support the rebels in Afghanistan. The Saudis serve to take money from the Americans and send it into this region. Americans think, well, we'll give the Saudis the cash will go in that region, it'll help for freedom fighting. No one ever checks where the Saudis are sending it. Someone like Osama bin Laden winds up spending years in Pakistan and Afghanistan. He doesn't do much fighting, but he's a huge conduit for bringing in money. His father owns a construction company. More bin Laden bulldozers than anything else go to Afghanistan and to Pakistan in the 1980s. So you have this group of rather radicalized Muslims who are extremely well funded, who are given the job of taking over, or sort of repelling, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, are told they are doing a religiously good, divinely ordained deed by doing so, and then in the early 1990s, don't have anywhere to turn. What they do have is a renewed suspicion of the Saudis. Because, of course, in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, all sorts of European and American forces arrive in Saudi Arabia to take back Kuwait, to protect Saudi Arabia and its own resources from Saddam Hussein. Bin Laden and others were outraged by this. They actually said to people in the Saudi government, let us come back and we will protect you. We've been in Afghanistan fighting. We will come back and protect you. And the Saudi royal family basically laughed. They said, that was great, but no. And so what you have is this group which then turned on the Saudis and turned on those who were seen as enabling the Saudis. Again. What the Saudis have done is they've basically spent a decade and a half exporting this problem, allowing the radicalization to grow, allowing the funding, the numbers, etc. to expand, and then experiencing what the people in the CIA call blowback. Americans are very good at developing terms like that. It means when all of a sudden everything comes right back in. So if you want to understand how and why we are regarded in some ways, looked at in some ways, how and why the Saudi state acts as it does to this day, you have to look at what happens in the 1920s and the 1930s. The failure of the Hashemites to get their kingdom, the failure of the Hashemites to hold on to Arabia, leaves this group, which then has its own sort of struggles. Think about September 11th. There were 21 hijackers on those planes. What do we know about those 21 hijackers? Be more bold in your convictions. 19 of the 21 were Saudis. So of course we invaded Saudi Arabia. Oh wait, no. 19 of the 21 are Saudi Arabian. People who've been radicalized, people who were associated with bin Laden and others, who saw the Saudi regime and its enablers, namely the Americans, as desecrating Mecca, as unworthy to protect Mecca. The Saudis have a problem. They still have a problem. Wanting to live one way, have a material sort of way of life, and also sort of profess a certain sort of Islam. Within Saudi Arabia itself, the Saudi royal family has tried to, in essence, pay off clerics and others. If they can't export them, they've put them in charge of social policy. They've put them in charge, they've created this internal police force, which is designed. Has anybody ever been to Saudi Arabia? It's a very odd place where there are enormous restrictions on public behavior. And people who will come and beat you and arrest you if you are seen as stepping outside those codes. Women driving. A man and a woman unsupervised. Or meeting together, an unmarried man and woman, excuse me, I should say. Unsupervised in some sort of public place. About 10 years ago, there was a famous incident in which a girls' boarding school was burning down in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. And the fire department arrived, and these religious police stopped the fire department from going in and putting out the fire. And about 40 girls died. Because they said, you are men, and those are unmarried women, and you cannot be in the same dwelling together. The fact that you're wearing your helmets and carrying hoses and axes and everything else to rescue them is immaterial. But this is the bizarre, almost schizophrenic sort of state that the Saudis have created. And it has a lot to do with the fact that this family takes over, that this family has this sort of beliefs, and by the way, Arabia has all this black stuff underneath it. It's a very strange combination, and it's one that the world is still dealing with the ramifications of today. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. We haven't even gotten to Iraq yet. We can still have 20 minutes to ponder the historical accident that is Iraq. But you can already see the way in which this region is very much driven by, is very much influenced by things that happened because of the First World War. Any questions about this? And I mean, I talk about this fairly energetically because no one listened. Back in 2003, there were people lined up willing to say, you know, this region is really complicated. You can't just go in there and say, we're here, yay, liberation. Pass out democracy. Here's your booklet, democracy, and leave. No. Zach.
The other question was, why isn't there like a war in Saudi Arabia right now?
A couple of reasons. The Saudis have been able to appease a lot of people in Saudi Arabia, either by shipping them elsewhere or by, and they're not the only sort of strict Islamic, in the 18th and 19th century there's sort of an Islamic revival in both Arabia and also in parts of what's now Pakistan and South Asia, where people think Islam has become too worldly. The people you don't have to worry about, the people in Arabia are known as Wahhabists. That is, Wahhabism is the form of Islam they practice there. The people in South Asia become known as Deobandis, based on a place where there's a particular school to train people to become Islamic scholars. So it's not just there, but it's the fact that these Wahhabists in Arabia are the ones who eventually take over. Why has there not been a war? There's multiple reasons. There's the Saudi royal family has, in essence, bought people off. They've given people positions within the state. The Saudis are enormously well protected by the Americans. There is, I mean, if you talk to people who are Middle East specialists or specialists in this part of the world, they will say that yes, the big worry that everyone has is what happens in Saudi Arabia, because eventually the oil is going to run out. And already they've reached what they call peak oil in Saudi Arabia, and that is oil production from now is going to decline at not a precipitous rate, but at a significant enough rate. And what happens is the Saudi state is going to start running out of economic opportunities. And there are a lot already, and there's going to be many more, unemployed or underemployed Saudi men who are going to be you might say they are going to be the ones who will raise the most sort of concern as political opposition, and ones who might be swayed by all sorts of ideologies. But again, large numbers of unemployed younger men. That's something that this entire part of the world is dealing with right now, and it is a recipe for real political unrest. Not just what's happened in the last 5 years in places like Egypt, Tunisia, but what might happen or may come in places like Saudi Arabia.
So there's technically no political figure in Saudi Arabia. Like the royal family has their...
Well, there's the king.
Yeah, the king and stuff, but it's not like he's trying to he's just worried about his money and stuff. So it's like,
yeah, they're worried about their preserving themselves, yeah.
So there's no trying to fix the country or try to...
No, there have been some efforts and people will talk about reform, but there's a lot of resistance in the royal family to reform. And there's also, I mean, there's questions in the royal family because the royal family is so large. There's questions of factions developing and divisions developing between members, and because you've got people having sort of multiple wives and having children by multiple women, and you have sort of rival contenders for the throne. So yeah, that's the Saudi royal family is much more concerned about what's going on in and itself even than what's going on in Saudi Arabia. I mean, and the Saudis have, in essence, they have this world that they have sort of subcontracted. That is, if you go to Saudi Arabia, all the construction there is done by people mostly from India and South Asia, generally. You have domestic servants, some of whom are held in basically slavery, many of whom come from the Philippines. And you have a significant amount of the engineering and administration of the oil fields and oil production done by Europeans and Americans who live in special, basically, compounds. Aramco is the Saudi oil company that basically employs thousands of non-Saudis, people from outside the Middle East, who live in these places that are sort of, resemble, I don't know, like Dayton, Ohio. It's the only place in Saudi Arabia where you'll see women wearing shorts because they are protected in these enclaves. Once you go out, you have to cover up. You can't drive a car, etc. etc. So you have, as I said, a Saudi state which is still dealing with the ramifications from this era, and then you've got this place, Iraq. Iraq is created by the British in 1920 to unite together about 3, or you might say 3.5, former Ottoman provinces. There is no historical entity called Iraq. The name is made up in 1920. There had always been people living in this region. The history of this region is enormous and complex. This is, by some people, considered the cradle of civilization, where settled agriculture first takes hold between the Tigris and Euphrates River. The center of the Islamic world in the year 1000 is the city of Baghdad, which was considered by people to be the most splendid city that the world had ever seen. But you don't have a state called Iraq. You don't have an Iraqi nationalism. Instead, you have an invented place by the British, which is designed to do several things. It's designed to give them access to oil in the north, access to the Persian Gulf in the south, to serve as a British buffer between, you've got Iran, or as it was then called Persia here, further north. Ultimately, you've got Russia to serve as sort of a buffer between Russia and India, a British colonial possession. It's a place that doesn't make any sense unless you look at it from the British perspective. If you look at it from the perspective of the people in Iraq, there is not a lot of reason for this place to exist. It's basically taking these 3 provinces and welding them together and saying, this should work. We hope. Because you have a blend of both ethnicity and religious belief. You have Arabs here in southern and central Iraq. People who speak Arabic are ethnically Arabs. And then you have people up here called Kurds. They are not Arabs. They're also, as they will tell you, don't ever say this, they're not Turks. They're Kurds. They might be related more closely to Turks than to Arabs. But separate language, separate culture. Kurds have, for at least 100 years, if not longer, been trying to form an independent Kurdistan in this region. That includes not only parts of what's now northern Iraq, but also parts of southern Turkey. There's also Kurds in northern Iran. You also have a religious split. That is, you have here in the western part, the central and western part of Iraq, and in the northern part, people who are Sunni Muslims. Sunni Muslims make up the majority of the world's Muslims. That is, about 85% of the world's Muslims are Sunni Muslims. About 12 to 13% are Shia or Shiite Muslims. However, in Iraq, well, Sunnis may be more spread out, there are more Shia Muslims. There is one majority Shia Muslim state in the world. Anyone know what it is? Where Shia Muslims are the absolute majority. Iran. What you have here is you have Sunni Arabs whose orientation is towards Arabia, towards Syria, places where there are other Sunni Arabs. You have people here who are Arabs, yes, but whose Shiite affiliation draws them towards Iran, or as it was then called Persia. And up here you've got people whose primary identity is as Kurds. So you're going to weld them all together, which is what the British decided to do. The question the British have to figure out is, how do you keep this state together? This very unwieldy state. And the British decide upon a traditional colonial solution. You might call it divide and rule. Which is that the British decide that they will, in 1928 they do, give this place its independence, at least nominally, but they make sure that the people who run the place are Sunni Arabs. Faisal, a Sunni Arab, is the king. The kind of government he implements, the kind of military command that exists there, is one which recruits heavily from Sunni Arabs, despite the fact that they are not the majority of the population. Because, and this is how sort of colonial divide and rule works, the outside colonial power finds a group who, if they were sort of, simply left to their own devices here, would not enjoy paramount power. They weren't the majority. They wouldn't win elections. They wouldn't be dominant in some sort of insurrection. But what the outside power, the colonial power, does is it favors them. It assists them. It allows them to come to dominate this region, even though numerically they are not the majority population. Not even the plurality of the population. Not the largest group. And between the early 1930s and basically the end of the 1980s, first the British and then the Americans decide, we want to live with this Iraq. First, because it provides access to oil, it gives you strategic presence in this region. By the 70s and 80s for the Americans, because it serves as a bulwark against Iran, and will fight a very useful war against the Iranians for much of the 1980s. It makes sense to keep in place a regime where you first have the king and then you have a series of military rulers, culminating, of course, in Saddam Hussein, all of whom are Sunni Arabs. You have a state dominated by the Sunni Arabs. In order for this state to work, it has to be held together artificially. What's a good artificial way to keep people together who don't want to be together? No, well, there is money, but it is even more primal. Did you say drugs? Yes, okay. Dylan, I don't want to know about the weekends. Okay. It's like Ferris Bueller drugs. Anyway, you guys have probably no idea what they are. All right. What's the other thing?
War.
War. Translated to another word, begins with a V. Violence. Violence. Yes. Not Valium, although Dylan perhaps would suggest that. But violence. That's how you keep this state together. You keep an artificial state together artificially through the use of violence. Violence perpetrated by this minority group, Sunni Arabs, which receives an enormous amount of support from the British and then from the Americans over the course of the 20th century. And the British and the Americans are in essence sort of locked in just as Sunni Arabs are. They need each other. Because the British and the Americans support this minority rule in this region for so long that they can't go back on it. Because they're now affiliated with, they're now associated with violence. This group here needs the outside support to rule through violence. That's why you have, they say politics makes strange bedfellows. That's why you have, in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein regarded as a great American ally. Because he's holding this state together by violence, and he's also sacrificing millions of Iraqis against millions of Iranians. It doesn't make rational sense, it doesn't make national sense to have this place together, but it makes sense to the people who created it and the people who benefit from its continued existence. This is why, when, say, 11 years ago, you decide this doesn't work anymore, or rather, we need some place that's not Saudi Arabia to work out some deep-seated psychological issues in. When you break this apart, you have to understand, you cannot, this is held together, think of it as metal bands, holding together this entity. Those metal bands are violence. When you take out or you clip those metal bands, all of the energy in this place is going to fly outward. The idea that you can, in essence, take out the group that's been ruling by violence and been supported by outside interests for almost a century, you can take them out and everything will just keep ticking over. Reflects not just a sort of, a historical misunderstanding, but a deliberate and malicious almost refusal, a willful refusal to understand history. And to think, no, history doesn't apply to us. We can come in, we can liberate, quote unquote, and nothing bad will happen. This is what you have to understand. Going back to the First World War, anyone coming into this region, in particular American and British interests coming into this region, and saying, we're here to help, the reaction is, no, we don't believe you. And coming in to help in a place where for so many years, Britain and America propped up a violent and repressive regime, a regime which held together a state that really had no business being together in the first place. When you come in and you break up that particular state, the framework that keeps that state together, you cannot expect that everything is going to go swimmingly. You cannot expect that everything is going to sort of, remain as it was. You'll just have democracy. How? By wishing it. You can't do things by wishing it. Even my 3-year-old, because he knows if you're wishing it, you'd have flame, throwing rabbits in my house. He thinks those are great. He watches this Ninjago thing, which is terrifying. So keep your children away from it. But he thinks that, you can have sort of dragon bunnies. That's his new obsession. This strange child. You have this sense that you can sort of wish it. We'll come in and everything will be better. Why? Because democracy. You can't. And people didn't listen. In 2003, people said, this is a terrible idea. People did not say, Iraq is a wonderful place right now. What people said is, Iraq is basically a bomb. And when you send people to defuse a bomb, you don't just send people who say, well, I don't know much about bombs. There's all these people over here who know a lot about bombs. I'm not going to talk to them, and I'm not going to wear the protective clothing. And you know what? I'm just going to kind of try and do it over a weekend. And I'll snip this wire and see what happens. What the hell? After me, there'll be somebody else with pliers. He can snip the next wire, see what happens. That's not how you defuse a bomb. But that is how, apparently, you go and try to defuse this one. The results, of course, are something we're still dealing with today. So the lesson of this is, first of all, listen to the historians. Secondly, don't try and defuse a bomb. And thirdly, watch out for the dragon bunnies. All right, I'll see you all on Wednesday.